Hey everyone, welcome to a special election edition of the week that was. I'm Ed Greenberger. It is election eve. It's such a big situation that I actually found my razor, much to the chagrin of my wife. I want to focus on my former home, Florida. It's so important with its 29 electoral votes. Donald Trump narrowly won it last time, and he simply cannot win re-election without it. The other thing about Florida is they've been processing mail-in votes there for weeks, so it's the one huge early battleground that we could see called early on Tuesday night. I want to dive into the numbers, and we have a lot of hard numbers because so many people have voted already. And the state of Florida has all of these stats online, separated by party registration, so we know how many Democrats have voted, how many Republicans have voted, and how many independents have cast votes. Let's get to work. All right, first I want to show you the number of registered voters by party in Florida. Here you go. 5.2 million for the Democrats, a bit of an advantage over the Republicans, who actually did close the gap from 2016, right over the 5 million mark for Republicans. And independents, 3.6 million. Okay, so those are the registered voters in Florida. All right, now let's take a look at what I call the banked votes. These are the votes that the state of Florida has already counted. In other words, they're in the bank, and they're marked off by political party, Republican, Democrat, and Independent. They are already known quantities. It's a great piece of data, and we have so many votes already. Let's take a look. Here's what we've got. So far, the Democrats, 3.5 million. The Republicans have 3.4 million. Remember, these are people who are registered to these parties, and the people who aren't registered to a party, the independents, non-affiliated, 1.9 million. Now let's take a look at what that gives the Democrats. It gives them a lead of 108,000 votes. That's the banked votes, Democrats minus Republicans. So right now, in this process, as I'm describing it, it's 108,000 advantage for the Democrats. Now let's take a look at the independent voters. Again, 1.9 million votes from independents. And let's talk about what those 1.9 million might actually do. I'm going to make my first assumption here, and we have to make some assumptions because we just don't know. This is how the independent voters are going to break. I'm going to say that the Democrats are going to have a 5% lead here over the Republicans, Biden over Trump. Now that doesn't even really necessarily take into account what most of the polls are saying. Most of the polls are saying it could be double digits. I think most of them over the last few days, most of the big polls have had it around 10. Okay, so you take that 5%, you apply it to the 1.9 million that you see there, and you get a 96,000 vote advantage for the Democrats. So that's the independent voters. If it breaks 5% for the Democrats, that 96,000 number is the number that they're going to have an advantage of. Okay, and let's just keep in mind that we already had a 108,000 vote advantage for the Democrats based on how both parties voted up until now. So you add that to the independent vote advantage for the Democrats, which is 96,000. Keep that in mind. Okay, now you come to maybe the biggest guess that I'm going to make here. And we have to make a guess with voter turnout because we just won't know what it is until all of the votes are counted. So the only way you could really figure it out and nail that number is by getting into a DeLorean, getting up to 88 miles an hour and going 2 days or 3 days into the future. So I'm going to make an educated guess based on what the numbers were 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, the Republicans had a huge voter turnout advantage. They actually had an 81% turnout to the Democrats' 74%. We're going to give the Republicans an 82% turnout this time around, up one little tick from last time, and the Democrats are going to be up a few points from last time to 77%. So that's going to give the Republicans still an advantage of a 5%, voter turnout. So that's still pretty good for Donald Trump. I think a lot of people would maybe assume that it would be closer to even, but we're going to give the Republicans a 5-point advantage here. And then you look at the independent voter turnout. I'm estimating it at 63%. That's exactly what it was 4 years ago. So I'm going to keep it the same there. Again, it could be higher, could be lower. We'll see. Okay, so we're going to take those voter turnout percentages and we're going to apply them to the registered voters in Florida, and here are the numbers you get. These are the expected votes for each political party in this election. I'm talking all the way around, all votes inclusive, whether it's mail-in ballots, election day on the day of, or whether it's in-person early voting. At the end of the election, this is what we would expect to see based on these estimated turnouts. And as you can see, the Republicans have a little bit of an advantage, about 100,000 vote advantage over the Democrats. Again, that's because their turnout is higher, 82%. And with independents, we would have a total vote of 2.3 million. Okay, now let's take a look at what that would mean for votes that haven't been cast yet. If you take these numbers on this second line, the expected vote, and then you subtract what we've already got banked, we would expect almost 500,000 votes to come in for the Democrats. That could be mail-in ballots. It could be in-person voting on Election Day. A little more than 700,000 for the Republicans, so there are still a lot more votes out there for the Republicans. And then for the independents, about 367,000 votes still out there that we would expect to continue to come in before the election is completely over. All right, so let's carry those numbers over to this screen where we've got the outstanding Democratic votes. Again, I told you almost 500,000. Outstanding Republican votes, little over 700,000. If you look at these two numbers, subtract the Democrats from the Republicans, then the Republicans have an advantage of almost 218,000 votes in the votes that are yet to come in. But let's go back to the lead that the Democrats already have in banked votes, votes that have already been counted. I showed you those two numbers before, the independent votes that swung for the Democrats and the votes from the Democrats and Republicans, what kind of advantage they had on those. Again, these are votes that have already been counted, and it's a little over 200,000. So you look at those two numbers, and the votes that the Republicans have outstanding that are still to be counted look to be a little bit more than what the Democrats already have as a lead. Looks pretty good for the Republicans. But don't forget about the independent votes. We still have a few 100,000 of those that we are still waiting to come in and count. So we can apply the 5% independent advantage for the Democrats there. And of the 300 or 1,000 votes that are still to come in, I think it's around 360,000, that's going to give the Democrats an extra 18,000 some votes advantage. Okay, so let's do some math. You've got 217, almost 218,000 votes that are still to be counted advantage to the Republicans. You've got the Democrats with nearly a 205,000 vote lead in what they've banked already, votes we've already counted, and then you add to that 204,000 the 18,000 number, because that's what the Democrats' advantage is going to be with independent votes that are still to come in, and then you subtract that 223,000 number or so from the 217,000 that the Republicans have. In other words, the fourth and fifth line here minus the third line, and you get a lead of 5,430 votes for the Democrats once we've counted all of the votes. Okay, so that's a 5,000 vote lead for the Democrats for Joe Biden, right? Well, maybe not. Probably not. One thing we're forgetting and we haven't talked about yet is not all Democrats vote for Joe Biden and not all Republicans vote for Donald Trump. We've got what we call the crossover vote, or defectors, Republicans who vote for Biden and then Democrats who vote for Trump. We don't know exactly what those numbers are going to be, but we do have a pretty good idea, if you just think about it logically, that Joe Biden is going to benefit there at least a little bit. You can't imagine more Democrats voting for Donald Trump than Republicans voting for Joe Biden, right? So, again, we have to make a guess. And the guesses I've made here on the crossover votes are based on the New York Times Siena poll that came out just yesterday of Florida. They had Democrats, 4% of them, voting for Donald Trump. Okay, so Trump benefits from a 4% crossover vote. So if you look at that and you look at the number of Republicans who have voted in this election, the numbers that we have, then that means Trump would get an extra 160,000 votes. Now look at the number that we have for Joe Biden, Republicans voting for him. Again, the New York Times Siena poll says that's 8%. That makes sense because, again, we think that Biden is going to have an advantage there. And in fact, I looked at the three major polls from the last few days of Florida, and they all had a 4% swing. So I think this 8% to 4% makes a lot of sense. So you subtract the first number from the second number, and you get Joe Biden with a nearly 170,000 vote advantage in those crossover votes. That's huge. Now remember the lead that we saw before we started doing the crossover votes. It was the Democrats leading by 5,430. So if you add those last two numbers, the 169,000 vote edge that Joe Biden has in the crossovers and the 5,430 vote edge that he had before we started talking about the crossovers, and you get a final, absolute, finito, finished, it's over tally of Joe Biden winning the state of Florida by nearly 175,000 votes. Now, again, there's a lot of guesswork there. There are some numbers you just simply have to guess. There's no way we can know them. We had to guess at the turnout numbers for the parties. We had to guess at how much Joe Biden might win the independent vote by. We had to guess how much he might win the crossover vote by. But like I said before, I've kind of engineered these numbers to be fairly favorable to Donald Trump because most polls show Biden winning the independent vote by more than 5%. There are some polls that show Biden winning the crossover vote by more than 4%. And then you've got the turnout numbers. I did give the Republicans a 5% lead in turnout. Maybe that ends up being even. And if all of those numbers are higher than what I thought they're going to be, this kind of worst case scenario for Joe Biden, then Biden's going to win really easily. Now, yes, the numbers could go the other way. Perhaps Donald Trump actually maybe not wins the independent vote, but gets even in the independent vote, but I can't really imagine that. Maybe the turnout numbers are even higher for the Republicans. Maybe somehow, some way, Donald Trump doesn't lose as many crossover votes as I think he might. But I don't think anybody would bet on really any of those things happening, and they would kind of all have to happen for Trump to even really have a chance. So that's the way I see it. I see Joe Biden winning this thing. I think he's going to win it fairly comfortably. And I think that you're going to see the state of Florida called fairly early in the night on election night. And once that happens, if Biden wins Florida, then the whole thing is pretty much over because Donald Trump cannot win this election without those 29 electoral votes. Even if he does win Florida, Biden still has a lot of paths. But that's my official call. I think Joe Biden is going to win the state of Florida, and I think he might win it fairly comfortably. Well, enjoy election night, everybody. We'll talk about this on the other side. Maybe I'll be right. I think I'm going to be pretty close, but it's going to be an exciting night either way. I'm Ed Greenberger. Thanks for watching this special Florida election edition of The Week That Was.